Hi, everyone. This is Miss Lazar, and today I'm going to be teaching you about the evidence for evolution. Here is our structure for the lecture. We're going to be covering four topics. First, what is the anatomical evidence for evolution? What is the fossil evidence for evolution? What are the developmental and genetic evidences for evolution? And what are the final takeaways? During today's lecture, complete your handwritten lecture notes. I'll have this formatted so that black is mandatory, blue is optional, and you can use the structure that works for you. You can adopt this into outline format. You can use bullet points. You could draw pictures. It's up for you, but make sure you get all of the mandatory information copied down into your notebook. Pause, rewind, rewatch as needed, and enjoy. So I'm going to start with a big section in blue, and it's how we even got to the theory of evolution. While today we have all of these different types of evidence to support the theory of evolution, it started off as a theory based on more limited evidence, and that theory was proposed by Darwin. And Charles Darwin was actually not the only evolutionary biologist to study the theory of evolution. There were many people before him proposing ideas like Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and Alfred Wallace. Darwin's theory piggybacked on some ideas proposed before him, but he put his own spin on evolution, and he was able to accurately detail and put forth the mechanism of natural selection to explain how it was possible for evolution to occur. So in 1832, a 22-year-old Charles Darwin was assigned to board the HMS Beagle to work as a naturalist on a journey to South America. The idea was to survey the coast of South America to see what was out there. As a naturalist, Darwin was responsible for taking note of the landscape of every area they visited and collecting samples of living organisms that were endemic to or only found in those regions. This information would help them get a better understanding of the area and fill out the map of South America's shores. During this time, Darwin began to take note of some very interesting things regarding living organisms. When in Argentina, he came across fossils of organisms that he had never seen before in any book he studied or in person, although they seemed to possess physical characteristics that looked similar to animals living at his time. For example, the organism on the top left reminded him of an armadillo or a turtle because it had a hard carapace or shell that shielded its back. And the one in the bottom left had claws like a sloth, but it was bigger than any sloth that he had ever seen. Uh, so, from these fossils, he realized that there must have been living organisms that were different in the past and different from the species that live today. He took the fossils with him and he moved on. The next important location was off the west coast of Ecuador. The voyage stopped at the Galapagos Islands, and it would be here where Darwin would understand and develop the most important piece of his theory of evolution. While in the Galapagos, Darwin noticed some interesting things between living organisms on different islands. There were giant tortoises, finches, marine iguanas, and penguins. These species had unique features compared to any other species he saw in South America and even around the world. He believed that they were endemic and they were only found there on the Galapagos Islands. Not only this, but as he went around to the different islands, he noticed small differences among the populations of each species. For example, in the giant tortoises on Hood Island, he saw that the tortoises there had elongated necks and flat saddle-like shells, but on Isabella Island, the tortoises had dome-shaped shells with much smaller necks. With the finches, the birds on the right, he saw that on some islands there were dark-colored finches, while on the others they were lighter in color. They all varied in beak size and beak shape, and he noticed that they varied in what they ate on the islands or where they made their nests. So why would there be such a difference if they were all part of the same species? Were they actually different species of very similar organisms? Why would that be the case? How could that happen? He began thinking about these answers, collected his samples, and he moved on. Once he returned from his trip, he compiled all of his data along with other available data and came to the following conclusions. This is our first section in black. Number one, there must have been one original organism, an ancestor, that gave rise to all of the variations that he observed. Number two, over time, more variations were created and they were selected for based on the environment. And number three, their characteristics allowed them to be successful in the place they lived in and eventually gave rise to new species. Even though others were studying evolution at this time, Darwin was the one to popularize the idea of evolution and natural selection with his book on the origin of the species, which is where he wrote up his findings. Darwin's final conclusion was natural selection led to descent with modification and therefore evolution or evolution of populations. And so I want to tie this into something that you hear a lot. The most common misconception about evolution that you hear today is that humans are descended from monkeys. And in fact, this is a misrepresentation of the facts. As you can see in the cladogram that's on the screen, humans on the top right and monkeys near the top left are modern day species. They're like cousins. One is not descended from the other. In fact, they are both descended from a recent common ancestor that existed about 25 million years ago. And that common ancestor, that recent common ancestor that they share, was not a monkey, was not a human, was not an ape. It was a primate, and it had characteristics that both monkeys and apes and humans today share. And that's why those traits have been passed down to all of its evolutionary descendants. Okay, so as a result, others were inspired to find evidence to demonstrate the validity of Darwin's theory, and that's really where we pick up our lecture today with our four major categories of evidence for evolution. The first category we'll examine is anatomical evidence, then fossil evidence, developmental evidence, and finally, genetic evidence. Let's dive in to section 1. What is the anatomical evidence for evolution? So I put up on the screen pictures comparing the nails and skin and feathers of different organisms and the internal limb structure of different organisms. And if you look closely at them, you might notice that there are some similarities. Anatomical evidence means observing and comparing physical body structure similarities, and of course, comparing the differences too. Species that evolved from a recent common ancestor should share common anatomical structures. These structures may change in external appearance and function, but they may still have similar internal anatomy because that similar internal anatomy was inherited from a recent common ancestor that also had that internal anatomy. For example, if you look at the structures on the picture in the right, you'll see that these are the internal bone structures of human, cat, whale, and bat limbs. And you'll notice that they all have the same pattern: a big bone in beige, two bones next to each other in orange and yellow, a set of small bones in dark yellow, and then fingertips or finger bones in brown. One bone, two bones, many bones, finger bones. One bone, two bones, many bones, finger bones. One bone, two bones, many bones, finger bones. These common structures are called homologous structures. This is an important vocabulary term. Make sure you underline it. And these are body structures that organisms share because they inherited them from a common ancestor who also had those structures. There's the definition of homologous structures one more time at the top of the screen. You only need to write it once. And underneath that definition, I'd like you to write examples of homologous structures. And as we go through the next few slides, go ahead and jot down a couple examples of homologous structures. For example, here are homologous structures that are common to all mammals because they were all inherited from the common ancestor that all mammals share. All mammals have fur, or fur that has been slightly changed into hair. All mammals are viviparous, which means they give birth to live young. All mammals have ossicles, a specific set of ear bones. And all mammals have mammary glands that produce milk. Here are other examples of homologous structures that we can see in a cladogram. You learned previously how to interpret a cladogram. You know that the presence of a trait, for example, right here, this little mark that says claws or nails, indicates that an ancestral species at this point in evolutionary time developed the trait claws or nails. It was selected for, and that trait was inherited by all descendants of that ancestor population, which means that lizards, pigeons, mice, and chimps all have claws or nails, and those are homologous structures that were inherited from a common ancestor that also had claws or nails. But there are some structures that we've inherited that have lost their function or their shape significantly, and you probably know some of these. You might know about the appendix or the tailbone or coccyx. These are vestigial structures, body structures that are no longer used but are still present, likely because they were used in ancestral organisms and lost function over time. This is a really cool piece of evidence for evolution from ancestral species, because why would we have these non-functional structures if we didn't need them if we didn't inherit them from a common ancestor. They're still present because at this point they're not harming us, they're not selected against, and so they just remain in our bodies as evidence of those larger structures found in our ancestral species. Some examples of vestigial structures in humans include the appendix, which helped our ancestors digest food that was richer in fiber and raw plant material than our current food. The tailbone, which is a very, very, very small version of the tail structure that our ancestral primate species had. And this moving picture that shows how the tiny little hairs on your arm might stand on end, similar to how the hairs on our ancestral species might have stood on end to make themselves look larger and scare off potential predators. Here's some other examples of vestigial structures that we can still see. Snakes still have some small bone structures of the leg. Even though snakes have no external hind legs, they do have the skeletal structure internally, as do whales. And both snakes and whales retain those bone structures because they inherited those structures from an ancestor who had larger leg structures, and they aren't selected against, so they remain in the whale and the snake body. However, suggesting relatedness by only using anatomical structures is not always reliable because there are some tricky things. Sometimes homologous structures are not obvious, and it's really hard to tell that they are shared or inherited from a common ancestor. Sometimes structures that appear to be identical or very similar were actually inherited separately from two different ancestors. For example, the shape of the shark and the shape of the dolphin look extremely similar, but this is because they evolved to be adapted to similar aquatic environments. The teeth of the beaver and the tusks of the elephant look very different, but they are actually homologous structures, shared structures that are inherited from a common ancestor who also had long front teeth. So these tricky structures, the ones that look similar but were not inherited from a common ancestor with those structures, are called analogous structures. These are body structures not inherited from the same ancestor, but that evolved separately at two different points in time. So again, our example is the shape of the shark body and the shape of the dolphin body. Analogous structures are used for similar purposes, functions, but are not the same in internal anatomical structure. For example, if we look inside the similar shape of the shark and the dolphin, we'll see that the skeleton of the shark is made out of cartilage, whereas the skeleton of the dolphin is made out of bone. And there's lots of other differences too. Sharks use gills to get oxygen from the water in which they swim. Dolphins have lungs. They need to go to the surface to breathe atmospheric air in through their blowholes. Sharks do not nurse their young. Dolphins do nurse their young with mammary glands. Sharks do not have hair. Dolphins are mammals. They do have hair, and they're born with hair around their noses. So these shapes evolved separately at two different points in time, and they were selected for because they were adaptations to the aquatic environment. And if we look on this evolutionary tree, this cladogram, we can see where this, it's called a fusiform body shape, evolved twice. We had a common ancestor that actually most animals share that had that body shape, and that trait was passed down to cartilaginous fishes, to bony fishes. But then as organisms moved onto land, they actually lost that shape because four limbs was much more successful for surviving on land. But at some point in the evolution of mammals, a group returned to the water and evolved the aquatic body layout or the fusiform body layout because, again, that's a shape that is an adaptation for living in the water. It's selected for in the aquatic environment. So how do you tell the difference? Make a little chart like this, characteristics of homologous structures on the left, characteristics of analogous structures on the right. Homologous structures have similar internal anatomy, bones, muscles, etc. They developed from the same type of tissue, for example, bone tissue or skin tissue, and they may look different on the outside. They may also perform different functions, or they may not. They may look similar on the outside. They may perform similar functions. The characteristics of analogous structures are that they have different internal anatomy. They're made from different types of tissue, and we mistake them for being inherited from a common ancestor with that trait because they look similar on the outside or they serve similar functions. My second section is about fossil evidence. What's the fossil evidence for evolution? Well, first, what's a fossil? A fossil is the remains of bones or other structures or impression of an organism that have been preserved within a mold or within a rock. And these are pictures of different types of fossils. We can see petrified fossils. This is petrified wood. We can see mold fossils where you see the impression of a shell in this rock, bone fossils where we can see the shape, the 3D shape of the bone left over, an amber fossil where a living organism has been preserved inside of amber, or a carbon fossil where we can see the carbon imprint of this plant on this rock layer. So fossils are made in layers of rock. As layers of sedimentary rock form, organisms get trapped within the sediment, and over lots of geological time, the layers of sediment get converted into layers of sedimentary rock. The living organisms trapped within those layers get essentially washed out as water percolates through, and minerals replace their bodies, leaving behind a rock impression of the living organism. When we look at fossils, what we can do is figure out when they are from, because rock layers are in order of age. Rock layers are in order of age. The oldest are at the bottom and the newest are at the top. Radiocarbon dating is a technique that lets us determine a more precise age of a fossil, so we can compare which layers we find fossils in to determine their age, and we can also use radiocarbon dating in fossils of the same layer or to compare different layers to determine exactly how many thousands of years ago that fossil was created. So fossils can show us a couple of things. They can show us potential ancestors and what those potential ancestors look like. And they can also show us transitional organisms that might fill in the gaps between the evolution of one organism to another. The fossil record is the history of life as documented by fossils. And you can see on the right-hand side a fossil record, layers of rock over the last 650 million years, where we might be able to see the evolution of different animals and plants on Earth. Some things that the fossil record can show us are the points in time where particular groups of living things evolved. For example, dinosaurs first evolved during the Triassic Age about 250 million years ago, and they went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous Age about 75 million years ago. They can show us progressive changes in traits and structures of living organisms. They can give us an idea of the climate and the environmental conditions that an organism lived in, and they can show us what characteristics allowed species to move from aquatic to terrestrial life. Section 3, what is the developmental and genetic evidence for evolution? Developmental evidence is the comparison of developmental progression and anatomical similarity in embryos. So developmental progression is this on the right, how an organism develops from a fertilized egg to a fetus to eventually an organism that's ready to be born. On the left-hand side, we can actually see that very early in development, a fish, reptile, bird, and human embryo actually look somewhat similar. They all have gill slits that we don't use. We do not have gills, but we have those structures early in development because that's a trait that the common ancestor that we share with all of these organisms also had. That trait, those gill slits, turn into something called the pharyngeal slits, which become in sharks the gills, and in humans structures of your face, your facial nerves, and also structures in your throat, all develop from the structures that in sharks would become the gill slits. Genetic evidence is the most important evidence for evolution, and it's also the newest. This is comparisons of DNA, RNA, and protein to determine evolutionary relationships. You'll learn this in more detail later in the course. DNA is genetic information inside your cells. It is converted into RNA through transcription and then into amino acids through translation, which are then folded into the proteins that make you you. The important thing here is that the code of the DNA determines the structure of the proteins that you have. And not just traits are passed down from parents to offspring or from evolutionary ancestors to modern day species, but the reason traits are passed down is because DNA is passed down. So, this is the most reliable and concrete evidence for evolution. And I have that in black. You should definitely write it near genetic evidence and maybe put a star near genetic evidence. If you're presented with multiple pieces of contradictory evidence, the genetic evidence is the one that you can rely on most. DNA and protein sequencing allows us to compare the genomes of other species. The more similarities there are between their DNA sequences, the more closely related the species are. Highly conserved genes are genes that have remained relatively unchanged through time and are found in almost all living things. These genes have very low mutation rates, and if mutations occur, similar mutations allow us to see evolutionary relatedness. So we can see which genes have changed or not changed, and that allows us to trace the history of evolution and how those genes were passed down through ancestral species. And our final section, number 4, the final takeaways. Number 1, all living things have a common ancestor. Ooh, that's a typo. All living things have a common ancestor. Number 2, more closely related species share a more recent common ancestor than distantly related species. Number 3, we can determine how closely related two species are by comparing their anatomy, their developmental stages, and their DNA. And number 4, the fossil record gives us a glimpse into extinct species that were ancestors of modern species. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned, and I hope you're excited to learn more about the evolution of all life on Earth.